lives of those on board. The ship, named Conscience, was carrying 12 crew members and 4 civilians. In a statement, the Freedom Flotilla coalition said, quote, Israeli ambassadors must be summoned and answer to violations of international law, including the ongoing blockade and the bombing of our civilian vessel in international waters, close quote. For WPFW News in Washington and WBAI in New York, I'm Sue Goodwin.
We people who are darker than blue, don't let us hang around this town and let what others say come true. We're just good for nothing, they all figure.
No, we are not, ladies and gentlemen. We are not good for nothing, no matter what they think. It is Friday, May 2nd, 2025, and you are listening to Darker Than Blue, the show where we talk about politics for the people who you just heard Curtis Mayfield say are darker than blue. Peace, dear listeners on the radio at WPFW-FM, Washington, D.C., and peace, everybody who is watching.
Just the surface of our dark evenings.
I am not sure what's going on.
If your mind could really see, you know your color, same as me.
There we go. There we go. Now we've got our audio cooking. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Darker Than Blue here in Washington, D.C. Welcome. I am Jackie Lukman. And yes, this is the show where we talk about politics for the people who you just heard Curtis Mayfield say are darker than blue. Peace, everyone listening on the radio at WPFW 89.3 and on the internet at WPFWFM.org, where, yes, we are changing the world one broadcast at a time. And peace to our faithful viewers on Black Liberation Media. Hey, y'all, on YouTube and on Lukman Nation on Facebook. A special shout out to my patrons on patreon.com/Lukman Nation. Thank you so much for joining me on this second day of May 2025. And yesterday, May Day was just observed in many countries around the world, and probably for the first time in a very long time, saw significant engagement in the United States, which has been very unusual in the past few years. But I can't help but wonder, y'all, if it's a good idea that we let a day established by workers to raise the issue of worker rights, pay, conditions, and to highlight the ultimate foundational contribution to any functioning society that workers do provide be taken over in this country by people who paid no attention to the day and the reason for it before, until, of course, Trump's second term now that threatens their comfort and stability in society. Now, look, but I know y'all are already mad. You're mad already. I get it, because a lot of you participated in those hands-off, what were they, 50501 indivisible protests yesterday. Listen, we certainly want people to realize that they have to fight this entire system that has brought us to this point. But I am not entirely sure that the original meaning of the day was conveyed well or at all in most of yesterday's protests in the US, and that bothers me. And it may sound petty, but I think it is important that we keep the origins and meanings of these kinds of holidays firmly rooted in their revolutionary, radical, even socialist foundations. And I use holiday loosely, friends, because in this country, it's not a holiday, but International Workers' Day, which is what we call May Day in this country, is a recognized holiday in 66 countries. So, my question today is, are we going to cede the revolutionary, radical, even socialist foundations of May 1st, International Workers' Day, to the liberal forces that have co opted it to turn it into anti Trump protest day? Because, look, we know that the Democratic Party is where progressivism goes to die, first of all, and they hate socialists as much as Republicans do. We know this. Let's stop being dishonest about it. Further, few of the protests yesterday had any real focus on genocide or imperialist attacks on formations like the Alliance of Sahel States and Zionist supported warmongering in Congo. Yes, y'all, the IOF is also assisting Rwanda in the warmongering and the brutality in Congo, all backed by the United States government. And these are all issues that socialists who are responsible for the establishment of May Day or International Workers' Day would have connected to the struggles of workers for dignity and justice. And while there were definitely some people at some of those protests who did go out there with messages of international solidarity for workers and raising up Gaza and raising up Congo, raising up the attempts of assassination against the leaders of the AES, all of these kinds of things, those people were few and far between amid all of the talk about hands off my Medicare, hands off my Social Security, hands off my domestic thing, and never mind about the continued struggles that workers have to endure around the world and in this country that are all connected to a big old word that starts with an I that you know I talk about all the time. But I have had the occasion to talk about this history that I am asking that we not abandon and connect it to current struggles over the 4 years that I was co-host of a little radio show that used to be on Sputnik Radio here in Washington, D.C. called By Any Means Necessary with Sean the Voice Blackman. Yes, we started this show after that show, and then Sean went on to do bigger and better things. But one of the things that I got to do 5 days a week, at the top of every show, I got to read an 8 to 10 minute monologue 5 days a week, every day. So every day for those 4 years, I wrote an 8 to 10 minute monologue in which I talked about whatever was going on in politics that day. And I talked about the history connected to it. So I actually talked about May Day at least 3 years in a row. And I think these monologues still provide a relevant analysis of the current conditions at that time and even now that I wrote those words I'm about to share with you to help center us on what we should be struggling against today, which is, I continue to argue, bigger than Trump. So let's start with my monologue from May 1st, 2020, which was a year after. And actually, it wasn't even a whole year because I started the job in December of 2019. So this was my first May Day monologue on By Any Means Necessary. And I called it Capitalism's Hijacking of a Socialist Gift to Workers. And it goes a little something like this. If you grew up like I did, when you were in elementary school, you and your classmates wore your best duds to school on the first school day in May, went outside and skipped to some song that you probably can't remember now as you wrapped some ribbons around a maypole, allegedly in celebration of spring, right? That's pretty much all I remember learning about May Day during my American high school indoctrination. But the truth is, that May 1st is actually International Workers' Day, and it is an official holiday in 66 countries, not this one. Observers commemorate past labor struggles for workers' rights, including reducing workdays of 10 or more hours to an 8-hour workday, limited the required work days from 7 days a week to now what we have a 5-day work week, addressing unsafe working conditions and ending child labor, well, officially on paper. But International Workers' Day is mostly recognized as a celebration of workers in countries other than the United States. And that's weird because the US is where International Workers' Day got started. It all began in 1884 when the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions, the predecessor of the American Federation of Labor, called for May 1, 1886 to be the beginning of a national movement for the 8-hour workday. Even though the federal government already had a law that was supposed to guarantee federal employees an 8-hour workday, the law wasn't enforced, typical of this country. And Illinois employers often made employees sign waivers of the law as a condition of employment. So it was typical for workers to be forced to endure 10 or more hour work days, even with a law that allegedly said that was illegal. Chicago labor organizers, in response, worked for 2 years to gain support for a citywide walkout to protest the long and grueling workdays, among other worker issues. Spearheading the effort were Lucy and Albert Parsons. Lucy had been born a slave in Texas around about 1853. She worked for the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War and moved to Chicago after marrying Albert, where she began writing and organizing seamstresses in the city. Albert was a printer, a member of the Knights of Labor, which was the first major labor organization in the United States. He was also editor of the labor paper, The Alarm, and he was one of the founders of the Chicago Trades and Labor Assembly. The Parsons were among a group of anarchists who sought to put an end to all hierarchical structures, including government. They emphasized worker-controlled industry and valued direct action over the bureaucratic political process. And these anarchists became respected household names across this country during that time of widespread labor organizing. Now, that organizing resulted in more than 300,000 workers from 13,000 businesses across the United States walking off their jobs on Saturday, May 1st, 1886. Remember, there was no weekend at that time. In the first May Day celebration or recognition in history. In Chicago, the epicenter for the 8-hour day agitation, 40,000 workers went out on strike. The protests continued into Sunday and Monday when the Chicago police attacked and killed several striking workers at the McCormick Reaper Works. A multi-day protest against the police violence was planned for May 4th through 10th in Haymarket Square in Chicago, and just as many as had walked out of work were expected to attend that rally, but rain kept many away. And at the end of the first night of speakers, 176 Chicago policemen attacked the remaining crowd of a few hundred. Someone who has never been identified to this day threw a stick of dynamite at the police, which set off a blind firing melee by the police, not just into the crowd of protesters where they think the stick of dynamite came from, but they never confirmed, but also into their own ranks in the rainy darkness of Haymarket Square. The organizers of the protests, Albert Parsons, August Spies, Samuel Fielden, Oscar Neebe, Michael Schwab, George Engel, Adolph Fisher, and Louis Ling were all arrested and convicted of murder, though only 3 were even present at Haymarket at the time, and those 3 were never identified as the person who threw the dynamite. On November 11, 1887, after many failed appeals, Parsons, Spies, Engel, and Fisher were hanged to death. Louis Ling, in his final protest, took his own life the night before his execution with an explosive device in his mouth. The remaining organizers, however, Fielden, Neebe, and Schwab, were pardoned 6 years later by Governor Altgeld, who publicly criticized the presiding judge of the original trials for the travesty of justice committed against the organizers. Now, immediately after the Haymarket massacre, Big business and government conducted what some say was the very, very first instance of Red Scare tactics in this country. Spun by mainstream media, anarchism became synonymous with bomb throwing, and socialism became un American. Yes, this is when socialism became a dirty word in this country with the help of US media and the political machine behind it. The common image of an anarchist became a bearded Eastern European immigrant with a bomb in one hand and a dagger in the other. And if that sounds eerily and awfully like an image of anti Semitism used in Nazi Germany, well, that's because it's very similar. But around the world, the story was different. In 1889, the International Socialist Conference declared that in commemoration of the Haymarket Massacre, May 1 would be an international holiday for labor known as International Workers' Day. But, as I said, not in the US. Because between 1921 and 1958, May 1 was designated as Americanization Day, a holiday of forced patriotism conceived after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and after a renewed current of militancy within the American labor movement arose. And in 1955, at the peak of the anti-communist Red Scare, Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy led Congress to pass a resolution deeming May 1st Loyalty Day, which was made an annual holiday 3 years later. In fact, President Eisenhower said in his first Loyalty Day address to the nation that it should be a day for, quote, solemn reevaluation of those priceless gifts of freedom, which are our heritage, end quote. Forget about all of the gifts of workers' rights that workers fought for, that created a day to commemorate workers that started in this country. You know, none of what Eisenhower said had anything to do with actual freedom. It was about crushing dissent and destroying labor unions and workers' rights movements in the US using the rabid anti-communist and anti-socialist sentiment that was very much present in US politics, pushed through the media, and spread among the population as an excuse. Now, what's worse, those holidays have been replaced now by a more insidious erasure of this deep history of labor struggle in this country with what is now a banal beach getaway day that we call Labor Day. Yeah, it's supposed to honor workers' Labor Day but it actually does not honor the real struggle for workers' rights in this country that the international workers movement honors to this day. So I said at the end of this monologue in 2020, let today, May 1st, 2020, be the beginning of a nationwide movement for worker solidarity, rights, and a renewed empowerment against the bloodthirsty capitalist forces that would still force us to choose a paycheck over our personal safety and the solidarity with working people around the world for their rights and personal safety and dignity. Also, once again, putting corporate profits over working people. Solidarity forever, workers of the world unite. And I still mean that to this day. But then on April 30th, 2021, the next year, I wrote about May Day in the context of the continuing interference in Afghanistan that the US was involved in. And this was interesting because people were waiting to see if Trump's planned withdrawal day from Afghanistan that was set on May 1, 2021, would actually be carried out by the Biden administration. Now, I talked about the hypocrisy of the Biden administration in refusing to withdraw troops from the country by that deadline and the garbage excuses they used to not do it. This monologue I called May Day Around the World focuses on the hypocrisy of US humanitarian efforts in Afghanistan. And again, remember, this was written in April 30th, actually, of 2021. So I said tomorrow is May Day and is celebrated as International Workers' Day around the world, but not as much in the US, which is weird since this is where it started, when the date was chosen by the American Federation of Labor to continue, excuse me, an earlier campaign for the 8-hour workday in the United States, which had culminated in the Haymarket Massacre, which occurred in Chicago on May 4th, 1886. But today, May 1st, 2021, was also the original date that the Trump administration and the Taliban agreed to for the withdrawal of US troops out of Afghanistan. Well, as I read this monologue, US troops were still there. And the Biden administration, I said, has violated the agreement using all kinds of excuses, from it would have been too hard to withdraw all those troops and equipment by May 1 to what's going to happen to the Afghan women if the US leaves them alone with the Taliban too soon. The US has long used the claim that it has a responsibility to protect the dignity, rights, and humanity of people around the world in countries where it claims vulnerable people's rights are being violated by somebody else, when the untold backstory usually almost always involves US complicity in creating the very conditions that this government tells us that it now needs to swoop in like a real-life Captain America to correct. Humanitarian intervention, given as a reason for the US to get involved in other countries' affairs, has frequently been a clever ideological cover crafted by US imperialists that is really the 21st century version of the age-old ideology of the white man's burden. You know, the idea that white Western civilization, led by white men, of course, and its accompanying ideals are superior to every other civilization. Therefore, it is the white man's burden to help or protect others from the alleged forces or violators of human rights that's not the actual Western dominators themselves, from the opponents of so-called democracy. And with that, we can see that the idea of Western civilization, or as Marjorie Taylor Greene and her cohorts wanted to advocate through a new congressional caucus that they wanted to call at the time Anglo-Saxon Values Caucus, Lord have mercy, is really nothing more than a thinly veiled code for white supremacy, or as I have come to call it now, white domination ideology. But it's been through this idea of humanitarian intervention and the related belief that the US has a responsibility to protect others around the world from oppression and tyranny that's allowed imperialism to win broad support among USians, even among many on the so-called left, and even among the working class, poor, and oppressed in this country, for everything from direct military interventions and drone warfare to punitive sanctions against whole countries and their societies. These actions are framed as the US defending human rights and even as upholding or defending democracy, with murderous consequences in places like Iraq, Libya, Africa as a whole, and Latin America, where NATO has expanded. And of course, in Afghanistan, where the issue of women's rights has long been a tool the US has used to justify intervention in the country. Defending Afghan women and girls from the sexist oppression of the Taliban, and by extension, the extreme fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, and some could easily argue from Islam itself, and plenty absolutely did, particularly the white conservative Christian evangelicals of said badly named caucus that ended up being called the Freedom Caucus. Same people, different name, same struggle. This argument about freeing those women and girls to live and express themselves in an open and democratic society, that was always the party line from the state under Democrats and Republicans regarding humanitarian intervention in the country. But the claims of the US wanting so badly to help Afghan women and girls are dubious. Not because there are not legitimate concerns about the dignity and safety of women in Afghanistan under Taliban rule. There absolutely were, and there are still, I think. The claims are dubious, though, because the US has never cared about the fundamental human rights of women and girls anywhere, not in Libya, not in Yemen, not in Nigeria, not anywhere that the US has supported or engaged in military actions that have killed and maimed thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of innocent women and girls. Not to mention the lack of concern that the US has had and continues to have for the human rights of Black and Indigenous and other working class and poor women and children right here in this country. As Black infant mortality, Black women's mortality rates mirror rates found in the global South. And that was before the COVID pandemic that has had a disproportionately negative impact on Black and brown women in the US. Then, of course, the fact that the Taliban even exists because of the US and its imperialist aggression against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, that has to be risen. Because where the Taliban rose out of the US, arming Afghans to fight the Soviets in a war that it couldn't actually win, but the Taliban won. And the people the US used to drive the former Soviet Union out of Afghanistan were left with a bombed out country, lots and lots of US weapons, and not much else. The US was not concerned with the plight of Afghan women and girls back then. So no, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan was driven by the geostrategic interests of US imperialism, assisted by its neo-colonial structure, NATO. And it was an arrogant expression of the white man's burden on behalf of the Biden administration to violate the agreement, once again, showing that Western ideology wrapped in a liberal blue flag knows better than the people of Afghanistan what's best for them. That's what the invasion of Afghanistan was about. For decades, the United States has used this disingenuous humanitarian intervention argument and the responsibility to protect doctrine, it's actually a political doctrine now, as reasons for invading and occupying country after country after country, and supporting dictator after dictator after genocidaire after dictator after genocidaire. Raising this issue on May 1st, International Workers' Day, and the troop pullout deadline for that same day, connecting the two, is important. It was important then, and it's important now, because it is overwhelmingly poor, working class, and oppressed people, workers, mothers, children, elderly, the disabled, the youth, who suffer the most under US imperialism and warmongering disguised as humanitarian intervention. The working masses of the world must rise up to demand true democracy, transparency, and self-determination for the people of Afghanistan and everywhere else in the world that the US and its imperialist cabal sends in troops and drone bombs with the claim of, we're here to help. This is why it's important for us to maintain the history of these people-created and people-focused commemorations, and not let liberals or conservatives, for that matter, hijack our stuff for their purposes. This is our history. It is our revolutionary history of struggle as workers, as marginalized people, as people who are connected by the strain, the connective tissue of imperialism, not just domestically in every industry, but with workers and people around the world. And a part of the revolutionary project is recovering this historical memory of the people's struggle that's lost, redacted, erased, lied about, and covered over by white domination ideology, settler colonial Christian fundamentalist, nationalist garbage that is run amok today. And I have to point out that in 2021, that was a year when there was a lot of worker struggle going on, a lot of organized labor struggle, which of course I talked about when I commemorated Coal Miners' Day, which is on October 12th, and celebrates the struggle of coal miners against exploitation at something called the Battle of Verdun, a piece of labor struggle in US history we're not supposed to know about, which is, of course, why I had to bring it up. But we're going to take a little break right now, dear listeners and dear viewers, because you know what time it is. It's just about 30 minutes past the hour, and it is time for a WPFW station break. So, engineer extraordinaire, tell the people what you got on tap for them today.
WPFW has been a site of resistance in defense of truth, justice, and culture for 48 years. Our spring membership drive begins with a special celebration of James Brown's birthday, May 3rd, and closes with a centennial birthday celebration of Malcolm X on May 19th. Two pillars of music and message. Your financial sustenance is needed more than ever to continue this type of programming. As a new listener or current member, this is your opportunity to contribute to the growth of an institution that stands resolute against both gross injustice and repression and the mass erasure of history and culture by amplifying the voices of scholars, artists, and activists whose work centers the humanity of all people. That's 48 years of being a site of resistance in defense of truth, justice, and culture. May 3rd through the 19th. WPFW works daily to build the world we want to inhabit by building a better world, one broadcast at a time.
Thank you so much. And what did I just tell you? What did I just tell you? We are fighting the mass resistance. We're carrying on the mass resistance to the erasure of this history. If they are insistent upon making a way for us to never talk about it, for you to never learn about it, then it is the most important thing that you could ever do to defy them, because information that we get in this history is critical for teaching us how to carry the struggle forward. And Coal Miners' Day is absolutely connected to this history with International Workers' Day. This is not a liberal kind of struggle that was going on here. The Battle of Verdun with the Battle of Workers' Rights in California and Oregon. Oh my gosh. So when I wrote this monologue in 2023, I think this was, California and Oregon were going through a huge struggle with Kaiser Permanente employees, because those employees proposed a two-tiered, they opposed this two-tiered wage and benefit system that Kaiser Permanente had proposed that would give newer employees lower pay and fewer health protections. The employee unions didn't want that. And they also wanted 4% raises each year for the next 3 years and a commitment to hire more nurses to relieve staffing shortages. Kaiser offered 1% a year with additional lump sums, and it said that it must reduce labor costs to remain competitive. Why healthcare needs to be competitive only makes sense in a capitalist system, but more than 24,000 nurses and other healthcare workers at Kaiser Permanente in the two states have they overwhelmingly authorized a strike in 2022, I believe that was, threatening to walk out over pay and working conditions strained by the coronavirus pandemic. Kaiser Permanente was one of the nation's largest healthcare providers, and I think they still are. Their profits held steady, with revenue growth each year since 2010. And in 2017 and 28 were two of the company's most profitable years ever, with net incomes of $3.8 billion and $2.5 billion, respectively. And Kaiser Permanente reported a whopping $5.2 billion in net income in the first 6 months of 2019. And they only wanted to give those nurses and healthcare workers a 1% raise and implement some multi-tiered system. And those workers were like, nope, we know you have the money. You're going to give it up. In Moline, Illinois, I pointed out that year, the vast majority of United Auto Workers union members rejected a contract from Deere and Company that would have delivered at least 5% raises to the workers who make John Deere tractors and other equipment. 10,000 workers at 14 plants across the United States, including 7 in Iowa and 4 in Illinois, were waiting to hear the outcome of negotiations with the company before they voted to strike. And they did eventually avoid a strike. But Deere and Company reported $4.68 billion net income for the first 9 months of its fiscal year, which was more than double the $1.993 billion it reported just the previous year. The company was expecting to earn between $5.7 and $5.9 billion in the fiscal year. I raised this in my monologue in Hollywood, California, the same year. The International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, or IATSE for short, which is a 128-year-old union representing over 150,000 artists, craftspeople, and technicians in the entertainment industry in the US and Canada. Well, they were prepared to strike for the first time in its whole history. IATSE said its members were subjected to excessive working hours, unlivable wages for the lowest paid crafts, and failure to provide reasonable rest, including meal breaks and time off between marathon working days and weekend work. Still having to fight for the things workers, socialist workers, want. Further, they say that workers on some new media streaming projects get paid even less. Although negotiations with the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, the group that represents hundreds of entertainment companies, the bosses, including the major Hollywood studios, streaming services, and production companies, continued, IATSE members had prepared to strike if negotiations weren't favorable and already had produced and deployed thousands of picket signs to be taken up the minute a strike was called. Then in Omaha, Nebraska, around 1,400 workers at Kellogg Company's U.S. cereal plants walked on off the job, saying negotiations with the company over pay and benefits were at an impasse. Meanwhile, in Kentucky, a strike by 420 workers against Heaven Hill Distillery was in its fourth week when I reported this on my monologue. Earlier that summer, 600 workers at a Frito-Lay plant in Topeka, Kansas, and 1,000 workers at 5 Nabisco plants across the U.S. were threatening to go on strike. In June of that year, Smithfield Foods narrowly avoided a strike by thousands of workers at a plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. After a difficult 18 months, where many workers put in 12-hour shifts and endured mandatory overtime to meet pandemic demand, employees got tired of that foolishness. "We're drawing a line in the sand," said Rob Long. I quoted him in this monologue, who was a production mechanic who had worked at Kellogg's Omaha plant for 11 years. Kellogg's workers were also striking at the time in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee. And that wasn't the first time workers in the U.S. have drawn a line in the sand against exploitation and strike-breaking corporate entities. Today, the day I reported this monologue, October 12th, just happened to be Coal Miners' Day, commemorated because a few coal miners in southern Illinois fought off strike-breaking corporate goons in what is known as the Battle of Verdun, V-I-R-D-E-N. Coal miners lived and worked in deplorable conditions. They were subjected to the whims of the market, often out of work for the long summer months, and forced to migrate for poorly paid day labor. They often lived in company-owned houses. So when Elon Musk talk about bringing that back, let me explain to you what company houses and company towns are. The coal miners lived in company towns, company-owned houses. They were held in debt. They were compelled to patronize only company-owned shops where the goods that they needed to buy to survive, like food, was overpriced. And they were paid not with cash, but in a company script that was only valid at the company stores. You know what that was called before this happened? It's called sharecropping, and they continued to do it. And this idea of company towns, and please stop saying it's a good idea. If you knew your history, you would have shut that foolishness down as soon as Elon Musk typed it on the platform he bought at a loss. Anyway, back to this history. So the United Mine Workers of America called for a general strike across the nation in 1897 to confront these issues. A flamboyant 31-year-old Southern Illinois miner who called himself General Alexander Bradley. As far as I know, he wasn't a general in anything. But anyway, he outfitted himself in a silk top hat, a Prince Albert top coat, and an umbrella, looking very much, it sounds like the fat Monopoly man, the Monopoly guy. Yeah. He went from mine to mine in Southern Illinois, leading marches among the miners in a crusade to unionize the workers. By the end of 1897, the UMWA, the United Mine Workers of America, their ranks grew from just 400 at its founding in 1890 to over 30,000. And here's the key: multi-ethnic, interracial members. You see why they don't want you to know this history now, right? The UMWA had the strength to negotiate a deal with most coal operators for an 8-hour day, a 6-day week, major concessions for better working conditions, and a 30% increase in wages. That's not just the power of union organizing, that is the power of intersectional, intergenerational, multi-ethnic, multiracial worker organizing. But the operators of the Verdun mine in Illinois tried to use racially divisive tactics to break the strike by recruiting non-union Black laborers from Birmingham, Alabama, who themselves were victims of convict leasing and convict labor. They were often framed for minor offenses like vagrancy, a crime that literally did not exist until after the end of the Civil War, framed for minor offenses and forced to walk off their crime in the mines, because the Constitution says under the 13th Amendment that you can still be held in slavery if you're convicted of a crime. Yay, democracy. The Black miners who were duped into being strike breakers by being told that the regular workers in the Verdun mine had left their jobs to fight in the Spanish-American War. So they were needed to go to Verdun, Illinois, to fill their places. And they were taken there with a heavily armed security force. I wish I were making this up, but I'm not. The security force was the Teal Detective Service, spelled Thiel, Detective Service, hired by the Verdun mine operators. The striking Verdun miners heard that the mine was bringing in strike breakers and set up an armed barricade to stop them, but they may not have been expecting a heavily armed security force or a force as large and as heavily armed as what met them, that opened fire on the miners first. After the exchange, 12 men were killed, 7 were miners, 5 were armed guards. 40 strikers were wounded. None of the Black strike breakers were wounded, because I imagine they won't get out them trucks. Some of the strike breakers stayed and found work in the mine, but some, and a vast majority, also stayed, but they joined the Union. Bradley's defiance and protest against Verdun rang out across the country as a bellwether of the Union movement's resolve and power. They held the line, period. Within 7 years, the holdout Carterville coal operator of the Verdun mine system declared bankruptcy and was forced to negotiate with the Union. Now, we may not have to have shootouts with greedy mine operators today, but the rallying cry for all workers on the line or about to walk it to fight against exploitation, it's the same. Workers unite, hold the line. But, dear listeners and viewers, how do we hold the line when the line keeps getting moved by liberalism? Right? But this is why I argue we need to know this history of labor and worker struggle, because there are victories that we need to know about to inspire us to continue fighting for all workers' rights in every industry, all of them. I don't care what it is. And yes, I do mean sex work. Work is work, unless, of course, you're a cop, because that's being an agent of the state. And you don't have to do that work. Nobody's forcing you to exploit other people on behalf of the state. So, no, cops and the military are not workers. Restoring this history of struggle to its proper place of reverence, reflection, and replication, if necessary, is key to restoring a society's historical memory of itself and its people. Something I learned when I visited Cuba for the first time in 2022 to commemorate the first May Day parade since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. There I learned, I think for the first time, I may have heard this thing for the first time, this thing called historical memory, and the need to recapture that discarded history of the people who struggled against imperialism and won, restoring their countries to history to reflect its whole people and not just the history of the Spanish or the Portuguese, or in our case, European, British colonizers that wrote our people and our struggle out of it. So this monologue I called Revolutionary Cuba Delivers Marching Orders to the Left to Defeat Imperialism for All Humanity. But are we listening? It seems that corporate media has gone even farther to legitimize the imperialist US, EU, NATO proxy war in Ukraine while I was away, I said in this monologue in 2022. In Cuba, that's where I was, celebrating a momentous International Workers' Day, or May Day for short. Now, it seems that US politicians are openly calling the dangerous quagmire in Ukraine a proxy war, but putting a spin on it that is even more terrifying. Driving in this morning, I said about driving into work and listening to Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Report that some US politician on Fox News said that Ukraine is a proxy war, that the US must win. Well, look at that, I said. All it took was a week for the imperialist war machine and its proponents to adopt the language of the left opposition and turn it into a good thing for the imperialists. And honestly, I kind of blame so-called leftists for this. This is what I said in 2022, and I would still believe it now. Because if there had been a clear and unified line among us about Ukraine, not just since February of that year when Russia finally responded to 8 years of US, EU, NATO-backed civil war against mostly ethnic Russians in the Donbass, Luhansk, and Crimea regions in Ukraine, but we on the left needed to be a lot more clear and resolute about the expansion of NATO before that point, as well as the US proxy wars, regime changes, and other covert democracy-destroying actions in other countries long before then. I said then, but since the Iraq War, the anti-imperialist left has seemed to be dwindling down to just the anti-war left, who is okay with a little imperialism if the war that is fought is to defeat an enemy that the very imperialist state that started the conflict says has to be defeated. Now, I want to be confused by this. I almost want to be defeated by it and just throw up my hands and go on home, but I was just too sure that a better world is possible because I had just come from revolutionary Cuba, and there was no way not to think that a better world was possible when you've seen that it can be done against all odds. It had been jarring, though, coming back to the US, where the confusion about who the aggressor in this conflict is. And the confusion was so profoundly deep and expansive among so much of the US population, but particularly on the alleged left. And that didn't exist in Cuba. As a matter of fact, the Cubans were very confused about how we were confused. And coming back to this confusion was jarring because in the closing session of the May Day celebration in Cuba, Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Parilla made clear that Cuba is in solidarity with other countries that are the targets of US imperialism and the efforts to destroy people-focused left movements in countries like Bolivia at the time, Nicaragua, Brazil, Venezuela. Then the country's president, Miguel Diaz-Canel Bermudez, reiterated that solidarity with those countries and added emphatically, he actually pounded the dais, that Cuba is also in solidarity with the demand by Caribbean nations through CARICOM for reparations for the global human trafficking crime against humanity, and he lifted up Haiti in particular. Woo, for me, that was a uniquely hopeful moment in the coalition of left forces around the world to recommit ourselves to the fight against imperialism that dogs all of our heels. I felt like we were given our marching orders from the political and ideological leaders of the country that continues to defend its revolution against US imperialism and aggression to unite in solidarity to defeat imperialism for all humanity, not just to focus on ending the blockade against Cuba, because it is imperialism that ties all oppressed peoples together. So it is the defeat of imperialism that will bring about peace and justice for not just workers, but for all humanity. Not that some of us needed those marching orders, since many of us were even in Cuba in the first place, because we're not just anti-war, we are anti-imperialists. And we understand that it is imperialism that is the primary contradiction, the one connective tissue that causes all of our oppression and injustice the world over. But as hopeful as that moment was for me, it was lost on some in the May Day delegation who still believed that ending the blockade against Cuba was the primary goal and the only goal of leftists in the US and around the world, and should be the only goal. And the repression of all those other people, especially, the Caribbean nations, Haiti, that can come, later on. Now, look, there's a whole nother discussion on why it's easier for some on the left to be in solidarity with Cuba and Nicaragua and Bolivia and Venezuela than with nations full of African people. And part of it is that they don't know that those countries are actually full of African people. But I can't get into that mess here because it is a mess and it just takes too much time that I don't have. But that's not what the leaders of the revolutionary government of Cuba said. And the disconnect is typical of US left politics. And I believe it's at the center of why we have been bowled over by this finely tuned, hyper-sophisticated propaganda machine in the US that has now co-opted the term proxy war as something good that the US must win. This well-oiled propaganda machine has turned neo-Nazis in Ukraine into non-issues, and that has reduced the former Soviet Red Army's defeat of Nazi Germany into a crossed-out footnote in history that we are now supposed to believe it doesn't mean what we think it means. Today, or at that time, a Ukrainian organization paid for a gigantic billboard in Times Square in New York City that turned Russia's Victory Day celebration of the Soviet Red Army's defeat of the Nazi Army on May 9, 1944, and the subsequent liberation of the concentration camps by the Soviet Red Army after their defeat of the Nazis. This Ukrainian organization literally crossed out the words Russia's Victory Day and superimposed on it Russia's Shame Day. They did that. And they got little to no resistance from corporate media about it, of course. But the thing that bothered me was they got little to no resistance from the US so-called left, because the left was so captured by the love of the plucky little Ukrainians, the country full of neo-Nazis, that they somehow had no problem getting behind because somebody told them that Vladimir Putin is the devil. And they believed it. The Ukrainian organization behind the billboard, that was displayed in Times Square, by the way, was the Ukrainian World Congress, and I think they're still around, which was funded by the fascist Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Yes, y'all, whomever approved that billboard just took a fascist organization's money and helped them rewrite the Soviet Union's victory over Nazis as something Russia should be ashamed of. And the left did not protest much at all. I would give up in the face of all this if I had not seen what little Cuba has continued to do since 1959 in the face of a brutal, criminal, genocidal blockade against its people. I would give up had I not met Janice, a member of the Committee for Defense of the Revolution in her neighborhood in Cuba. At the evening block party they threw for us, I asked her what she would say to U.S. citizens who believe that all the outpouring of support for the Cuban government that we see is forced. Janet told me that the people in her neighborhood live together like a family, and the people of Cuba live together like a family. What we want, she said, is to live with the whole world like a family. And when she was talking, she literally did her hands like this. She said, we want to live with the whole world like a family. But first, the world has to defeat imperialism. She said the revolution in Cuba is strong and cannot be defeated by US false propaganda or a 60-year blockade. If we on the left in the US want to end the blockade against Cuba, end the repression of left movements in the global South, want to end the repression and exploitation of Africa, want to bring about justice for nations looted in the global human trafficking crime against humanity, if we want to end this genocide and make sure another one never ever happens, if we want to protect the AES, we must also not be defeated by the US's false propaganda. We must recommit and redouble our efforts to defeat imperialism, not Trump, not Trumpism, because that is the primary contradiction for all of us. Imperialism and its demise is the only hope for humanity. I'm not telling you this. The revolutionary Cubans said so. I will leave you with this. We need allies who are going to help us achieve a victory, not allies who are going to tell us to be nonviolent. If a white man wants to be your ally, great. But what does he think of John Brown? You know what John Brown did? He went to war. That is a quote from Malcolm X. I cannot end this on a better note. I will see you on the line and on the battlefield. Workers of the world unite. Hold the line. Peace.